Hello and welcome to the Justice Factor. Public Enterprises Minister Malusi Gigaba has unveiled a new plan to turn around the fortunes of South African Airways. Haven't we heard this before? Gigaba says this time, failure is not an option. Minister Gigaba joins me today to discuss SAA and other issues. After that discussion, we'll give you, as usual, our winner and loser of the week. But first, let's consider this. Will the ANC lose support in the 2014 elections? Peter Montalto, an emerging markets analyst at financial services company Nomura, says that votes for the ANC could drop from 65.9% to 56.2% in next year's election. Is this true? My guests to discuss the road to 2014 are political analyst Ebrahim Fakir of ASA and Ralph Mathekga of Clear Content Research and Consulting. Guys, welcome to the show. Ralph, let me start with you. I mean, look at that graph, 65.9 to 56.2. Is it thumb-sucking this thing?
It's quite a radical shift. I mean, it's an extraordinary turn of event if it does take place. I'm expecting that normally, naturally, the governing party that had won election, like the ANC had done consistently, has been in power for about 19 years, will naturally lose elections, lose the margins at around 4% or so. It does happen. It's a question of incumbency. But 65% to 56%, that's too radical. I don't think that's possible. What would
be the driver? What would drive such a massive loss of support for a party like the ANC, if it were to happen?
I think there's speculation about the strength of the opposition parties in South Africa, that there will be significant shift in terms of people moving from the ANC to opposition parties. I don't think that analogy is correct, because voters do not usually radically shift from one party to another. Voters sometimes sit in the middle in something that I like to call a transit lounge, where they sit in there while waiting to consider in the subsequent elections as to where to take their votes.
Ebrahim Fakir, do you think that's a transit lounge? Because he's saying actually they're going to go from the ANC 65.9% to the EFF, which he says will come in at 4%, or COPE, AHANG, which will come in at 6%. Do you buy these numbers?
Justice, I'm not sure whether this is in fact junk science or not, because I don't know what the sampling was, what the extent of it was, what the representativity of the sample was, etc. So I'm not going to make a pronouncement on that. At the same time, I'm also not a Sangoma, so I don't know, what's going to happen. But really, if you look at these numbers, it does look a little bit far-fetched, because the reality is that though there is this transit lounge that Ralph is talking about, the question we've got to ask is, what's the extent of that transit lounge? Now, I'm not sure that the number of swing voters which are there, which are going to decide an election, which are going to decide the numbers one way or the other, as to such an extent that they're going to bring down the ANC's majority so dramatically. I suspect what is going to happen, and we can look at some issues around the margins, some numbers around the margins. Look, over the last 3 elections successively, the ANC has lost close to about a percentage point, but that's the vote share. In terms of absolute numbers, that is the whole number of people who actually coming out to vote. They increased the number of actual votes that they got, but they reduced the number of share. That was because there's a greater number of actual voters who come out to vote.
Before we get on, let's look at the credibility of this number, something that you look at. Peter Montalto, of many political analysts, commentators, and so forth, in the run-up to the Mangaung conference of the ANC, he was the only one who said Jacob Zuma is going to come out with a massive victory. And he put it at 68%. Jacob Zuma actually came out at 75%. So, I mean, I do think he deserves a listen, don't you think?
Well, I'll dispute the fact that he was the only one who called the election in Mangaung.
No. Many of us put it at 60-40, not at such an overwhelming victory. Did you both?
I think it was quite clear that Zuma was going to get an overwhelming majority. I think if you look,
but many of us didn't get the 75, did we?
Yeah, I don't think it justifies that almost like 11% that we're talking about here. That's quite drastic. Something extraordinary will have to happen to see that shift. But I think another factor as well, it is going to be the question of the turnout as well, as to whether this election is going to see a decline in terms of the turnout. If the turnout declines, you are going to have more competition among opposition parties for the share of the votes that exist within the opposition. Actually, I think there will be a lot of movement among the opposition parties than outside the opposition parties to the ANC.
Do you agree with that turnout?
The trend so far, of course, suggests that that's going to be the case. Turnout is going to be key. There are a couple of misconceptions I think we need to deal with, and deal with them quite substantially right now. The one is that the DAs is going to increase up to 27%.
That's what he says, yes, from 16.7%. That's another drastic one.
That's quite dramatic. Now, if we look at the trend evidence so far, in the last local government elections, on average, the DA only increased its share amongst African voters, on average 3%. And that was us looking at voting stations in core African voting areas. Now, of course, local government and national government elections are not analogous. But remember, that was on a turnout of 48%. Typically, at national government elections and provincial elections, the turnout almost doubles. So in the last election, we had close to 77% turnout. And that's typically, usually, ANC voters who would come out in greater numbers. Remember, the DA's performance in 2011 in the local government elections was also a recovery for the DA from 2000. Rather than from, you know, a dramatic increase from 2006. So literally this is a recovery for them. Remember, their growth area can only come amongst African voters.
But that's what they're doing with, you know, BEE, we also fought against apartheid and so forth.
Well, one can quibble about the merits of that campaign, the factual accuracy, the strategic communications, whether it's in fact correct. That's a separate debate, but we can go there. I'm not convinced that that's going to push them up that far.
Ralph Mathekga, let me bring you in. So where the ANC goes there, some of its leaders have to leave a squatter camp to flee. Cyril Ramaphosa among them. Cyril Ramaphosa again goes to vets, is booed and heckled by people there. Is there a shift in South Africa now? Are people beginning to go against the ANC, or are these just isolated incidents? Is this a driver? Is service delivery a driver? Is corruption a driver?
Well, what I think has been happening is that the ANC has almost is having a problem when it comes to strengthening or building a rapport with ordinary citizens in the country. And what happens, the cause of that is that if you are in power, you are identified with power, and therefore you'll be critically evaluated. And as citizens are beginning to gradually evaluate the ANC as a party that occupies power, I think the party has not done well when it comes to strengthening local leadership. What we are seeing with service delivery protest, in my view, it is the collapse of local leadership.
Ralph Mathekga, Ebrahim Fakir, unfortunately I want to talk about COPE, IFP, the EFF, Ahang, but we don't have time. Next time we'll go into these other smaller parties. Thanks so much for your time. After the break, we ask Minister Malusi Gigaba if SAA can be saved.
News that moves. ENCA.com.